Why did Putin attack Ukraine? This question is being asked more and more often in society, 3 years after the start of Russian aggression.
I believe it is necessary to make a decision that has long been overdue.
Many in the West want to believe that Putin is the problem, and Russians are often seen as either passive victims of state propaganda or as unwitting participants in the horrors perpetrated by their government. But that's not the case, according to an opinion column in the American political publication The Hill. At home, Russians are willing to endure poverty, lack of rights, and even wooden outhouses. Instead, they seek meaning in Russian greatness and the subjugation of their neighbors. Russia is not a country united by common values, views, or goals, writes the author of the Hill article. And the author goes further. This empire is held together by force, bound by lies, and sustained by stealing from the art, culture, and history of others. Russia's predecessor, Muscovy, owes its rise in the 13th century to the role it played as a tax collector for the Golden Horde. And Kiev had already flourished as a cultural and political center for 600 years by the time Moscow was founded in 1147. Putin himself justifies his imperial ambitions by allegedly reclaiming historical lands. In 2021, he even wrote a 5,000-word essay arguing that Ukraine does not exist either as a culture or, as one might expect from Putin's propaganda, as a nation.
So how did Ukraine come to be? Who created it then? Vladimir Ilyich Lenin.
In the fevered mind of the dictator, Russians and Ukrainians are supposedly one people, but this imperial delusion has nothing to do with reality. Coming from Putin, these statements were essentially a threat. Ukrainians must either accept that they are Russians or disappear. Putin had been nurturing plans to seize Ukraine for a long time. In the United States, transcripts of conversations between the Russian dictator and former US President George Bush have been declassified. Even back then, in 2001 and 2008, the head of the Kremlin made it clear that he did not want to see Ukraine in NATO. The Russian dictator told Bush verbatim,
"I would like to emphasize that the accession of a country like Ukraine to NATO will, in the long term, create a field of conflict for both you and us, a long-term confrontation."
In Russia, they have long justified their aggression against Ukraine by claiming that everything here historically belongs to them. They claim they are not attacking but merely taking back what is theirs. You simply couldn't come up with a more absurd idea, says the project Collapse of the Pseudo-Empire, especially the claim that Kyiv is a Russian city. The entire purpose of Moscow's existence is its endless attempts to steal Kyiv. To appropriate Kyiv is to prove one's Europeanness, that is, one's connection to the civilized world, the project's analysts write. Kyiv is a mark of quality. Without it, the myth of an originally Russian city, a product of Putin's propaganda that emerged at the same time as the idea that Russia is Rus, doesn't work. The United States has declassified transcripts of conversations between the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin and former US President George Bush. Even back then, in 2001 and 2008, the head of the Kremlin clearly expressed his rejection of Ukraine's accession to NATO and other issues. This was reported by the press center of the US National Security Archive. So, as far back as 2001, Putin told Bush that Ukraine's accession to NATO would create a field of conflict between Russia and the United States and lead to long-term confrontation. The Russian dictator said to Bush verbatim,
"I would like to emphasize that the accession to NATO of a country like Ukraine will, in the long term, create a field of conflict for both you and us, a long-term confrontation."
When asked why he saw Ukraine's accession to the alliance leading to such consequences, Putin responded with his favorite narrative, claiming that Ukraine is an artificially created, complex state that was formed from the territories of neighboring countries. At the same time, he emphasized that supposedly a third of Ukraine's population are Russians and that a significant portion of its residents view NATO as a hostile organization.
This creates the threat of military bases and new military systems being deployed near Russia. This creates uncertainty and danger for us. And relying on anti-NATO forces in Ukraine, Russia will work to deprive NATO of the opportunity to expand. Russia will constantly create problems. Why?
Back in 2008, Putin already predicted a conflict between the United States and Russia. Perhaps even then he already had plans for Ukraine. The dictator expressed concerns about NATO's military infrastructure approaching Russia's borders. In Russia, they justify their aggression against Ukraine by claiming that everything here historically belongs to them. They supposedly are not attacking, but merely taking back what is theirs. You simply couldn't come up with a bigger absurdity, says the project Collapse of the Pseudo-Empire, especially the claim that Kyiv is a Russian city.
Kyiv is a Russian city, and from there comes a threat to the existence of the Russian Federation. an international threat. Because although Kyiv is a city with Russian roots, it is governed by an international brigade of Russia's opponents.
The entire purpose of Moscow's existence is its endless attempts to steal Kyiv. To claim Kyiv is to prove one's Europeanness, that is, one's belonging to the civilized world, analysts of the project write. Kyiv is a mark of quality. Without it, the myth of an originally Russian city, a product of Putin's propaganda that emerged at the same time as the idea that Russia is Rus, does not work. Putin's scandalous predecessor, Dmitry Medvedev, made a notable statement: Odessa, come back home. He also claimed that Odessa is supposedly a Russian city. These cynical statements are accompanied by continuous shelling, particularly of Odessa and the Odessa region, which causes suffering for people and destroys port infrastructure and the energy sector.
The Russian army continues its offensive along the current front line. At the same time, many Ukrainians are concerned about whether the enemy might once again attempt a full-scale offensive toward Kyiv. Military expert and former deputy chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Ihor Romanenko, stated during a chat on Glavred that Russia will continue to carry out massive airstrikes. At the same time, Russia has not yet amassed enough forces to conduct a large-scale ground operation. Russia's goal is to plunge Kyiv into a blackout, destroy the energy and heating networks, as well as the water supply. At the same time, Russia has not yet gathered enough forces to carry out a ground operation, Romanenko believes. The expert emphasized that Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin is striving to advance as much as possible in all directions where Russian troops have achieved some tactical successes. However, such a strategy leads to the dispersal of forces. At the same time, the Kremlin is in a hurry, fearing that opportunities may close. Putin now wants to grab as much as possible in all directions, believing that wherever there is progress, an offensive is necessary. As a result, he is spreading his forces thin, but is in a hurry, fearing that the window of opportunity will soon close, Romanenko explained. Therefore, unfortunately, airstrikes on Kyiv will continue, and Russia changes its tactics depending on new opportunities and means of aerial attack, he added. Romanenko noted that the Russian side is modernizing its missiles, improving drones and communication systems. At the same time, strikes on Kyiv remain regular. Russia will continue such actions further, right up until the cessation of hostilities, expert Romanenko concluded. In turn, former spokesperson of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Reserve Colonel and military expert Vladislav Seleznev, stated that in order to attack the Kyiv, Zhytomyr, Rivne and Volyn regions, Russia would need to deploy its troops on the territory of Belarus. And here, problems arise specifically with Alexander Lukashenko. I think Lukashenko is inoculated against such actions, because it is unlikely he would be satisfied with a repeat of the situation in February-March 2022, when he effectively found himself on the same side as Putin. I believe he will do everything possible to prevent the use of Belarusian territory for an offensive against Ukraine, he explained. Moreover, at the moment, the Kremlin does not have free reserves or resources to conduct another large-scale ground operation from the territory of Belarus. Although the situation could change, even in that case, any preparatory processes would take several months. Let me remind you that the preparation of the Russian army for the invasion in February 2022 took place under the cover of the so-called military exercises Union Resolve 2022 and lasted for several months in a row. Transferring 200,000 personnel takes time. The Russians won't manage with fewer forces. They already had a negative experience when in 2022 they tried to attack the Kyiv region and suffered catastrophic losses. Here we could also be talking about at least the same number, that is 200,000 personnel. And a potential new operation would also require moving a huge amount of equipment and ammunition, Seleznev noted. Even if Russia decides to take such a step, all preparatory processes will be detected by Ukrainian and foreign intelligence services. Therefore, Ukraine will be prepared. Although Russia claims to be playing the long game and its army has effectively been in a state of continuous offensive since October 23rd, anything can be expected. But the fact that these processes will be detected by intelligence is obvious. and certain preparations will be made by the defense forces. However, there is no point in such attempts.